You're skeptical of the state. You're getting over the myth of authority. But the state is still formidable. Or is it? You've got a front row seat in the transition to a free society. Let's dive headfirst into The White Pill Box with your host, Mark Maresca.
Greetings all, thank you so much for joining today. Today, I am so pleased to welcome as my very special guest, Dr. Walter Block. Walter, welcome to The White Pill Box.
I'm happy to be here with you. Thanks for inviting me.
Folks, if you are among the unlikely few who are unfamiliar with his work, Walter Block is a distinguished Austrian economist and a theorist of anarcho-capitalism. He holds the Harold E. Worth Eminent Scholar Endowed Chair in Economics at the School of Business at Loyola University in New Orleans. His work has been published in the Journal of Libertarian Studies, Journal of Austrian Economics, Psychology Today, and many, many others. He was a major contributor as senior fellow at the Ludwig von Mises Institute. If that's not enough, he has over, how many peer-reviewed articles is it? Because I'm sure mine is not up to date.
I'm up to about almost 800, but I'm no longer a senior fellow at the Mises Institute. I used to be, but I was demoted or excommunicated because of my views on Israel.
Yes, that was a disappointing outcome, that's for sure. 800, are you shooting for a particular number?
Yeah, I want 1,000, and I'm at 780 or 785, and I do about 25 a year. So if I last another couple of years, I'll make it.
To start with a sort of a walk down memory lane, and the reason is because I don't know if I've ever had a chance to personally speak with anyone who's been in ANCAP as long as me. I was red-pilled, as they say, in 1975, so red, white, 50. And it's rare that anyone goes longer than that I speak to, and you are that. So I'd like to do a simple contrast and compare of back then and now, in particular regarding how we saw prospects for liberty back then in contrast to now.
Well, I've been an anarcho-capitalist ever since I met Murray Rothbard in around 1966. And I asked them, how many libertarians were there in the world? And by libertarians, we didn't mean just anarcho-capitalists. We include minarchists and classical liberals. And he said 25. He had knowledge all around the world. I once took a trip across the U.S. and he gave me people to see in Chicago and in Denver and here and there. And how many people were there then? About 3 billion. If I had to estimate how many libertarians there are now, I would say 25 million. But then again, we doubled in size from 3.5 billion to about 7 billion, or from 4 billion to 8 billion. So we went from 25 to 25 million, which is a big increase. But the non-libertarians went from 3 or 4 billion to 8 billion. So we did very well proportionally, but in absolute numbers, it's horrible. So that would be my statistical guesstimates.
Were you as naive as I was? I was 19. And for me, I tend to be a kind of a logical person. I think rationally. I don't, I love thinking through things. I always have. And so when the ideas of liberty were exposed to me, and I realized the state is illegitimate, it's immoral to do anything that, for the state to do anything that a regular person like us can't do. Basically, when I woke up, I thought, well, this is easy. All we have to do is just tell everybody, and they'll realize it's just as logical and simple as I did. And I, at least in my thinking, thought, well, how long would that take? I figured a couple of decades before the ideas spread and we start seeing stateless societies. Now, I started by saying that was naive, but I'm very curious, when you first yourself kind of woke up and got red-pilled, what was your perspective for the prospects back then?
I never really thought about that then. I think about it a lot more now. And I guess it's fair to say that when I first started, I never really thought about that. I knew that a lot of people weren't libertarians, and I knew that I was odd man out. I was the the skunk at the garden party. In any group I was one libertarian, and there were 25 others. So I suppose I thought then that it would be difficult to spread the word. But more recently, I wrote an article maybe published 3 or 4 years ago, and I addressed myself, my co-authors and I, why are there so few libertarians? And we came up with sociobiology. You and I are mutants. We're weirdos. We're biological weirdos because we believe in liberty, and the masses of people, liberty schmibbity, they just don't get it. And my wife doesn't get it, and I've been at her since 1970. My daughter is a very smart young woman and never converted her to anything. My son happily is a libertarian. So I'm 1 out of 3 with my family members. But I think we are sociobiologically oriented toward grabbing stuff, violating rights, because the caveman who did that left more children than the caveman who didn't do that, kind of a thing. So my assessment is, yes, everyone will become libertarian in about 1,000,000 years if we last that long and don't blow ourselves up. So I'm not really an optimist for conversion of libertarians. But I don't really care about it because it's so much fun to promote liberty. So even if I never convert anyone else, and I do convert people, and I'm sure you do, we all do, a few here and a few there, and we write, and we don't know the results of the writing, but I've written many books, and a lot of times I'll get an email from somebody, I read this book of yours, oh, it's great, it converted me. So little by little, we're converting people. How do you measure how many libertarians there are in the country? The one way to do it is, what vote does the Libertarian Party get? And the Libertarian Party gets, 3%, 2%, something like that. When Ron Paul runs, maybe 4%, 5%, but call it 2.5%. On the other hand, there have been surveys of people, and they say, what's your view on economics? And they're pretty free enterprise. And they say, well, what's your view on legalizing pornography and prostitution, gambling, drugs, this and that? And they support that too. So that's a libertarian, and you get 15, 20, 25% of the population who will agree with both tales of the distribution of liberty. See, the conservatives, they'll answer the economic question pretty well, but the personal liberties, they're horrible. The lefties, they'll answer the personal liberties pretty well, not any better than they should, but pretty well. On the economics, they're out to lunch. So I think you can say that 15% of the 20% of the population is really libertarian. They don't all vote LP because it's sort of a wasted vote. You're not going to get the libertarian president, so they'll vote differently. That's why the vote is only 3%. But I think with a reasonable definition of libertarianism, we've got 15 to 20% of the population.
I love this. This was going to be one of the topics we were going to talk about. I have a feeling it's going to dominate the conversation. I'm very okay with that. Okay, so can we look at this from two standpoints? The person's view of their private life, people they interact with daily, their business relationships, their personal relationships, etc., as one sphere of their life, and the other would be politics, whatever might pertain to the bigger social perspective. I've made the claim that most people, if not all, are anarchist privately, meaning they expect what we call the non-aggression principle, they may not call it that, to be applied in their private life. Absolutely. So if the government were to say, tomorrow you get up at 10 and you eat this and you wear this and you associate with this person, most people today would say, no, I don't think so. I'm not happy with that. Now, maybe people in a terrible place like North Korea, maybe that is something that they might bend on. But I think the vast majority of people would look at themselves as someone who is not to be ruled over by anyone else in their private life. So before I go on, how does that square with you?
Oh, I think you're right. Most people are not rapists. Most people are not murderers. Most people are not thieves. Most people are polite. Most people would not violate the non-aggression principle, and most people would respect private property in their personal interaction. But when it comes to politics, I don't know, everything falls apart. I have a friend. Well, he's not really a friend. He's the husband of my wife's girlfriend. And he's a very nice guy. He lives in Canada, and what he does is he gets young men who are in trouble, and he sets them up into a soccer team. And they play soccer. And he goes to the Vancouver Whitecaps, the professional team, and he gets uniforms from them. And he's sort of an all-around good guy. And I once asked him, I said, well, do you have a right to come at me with a gun and say, unless I donate $100 to your efforts, you'll shoot me? So he was appalled. Of course not. And then I said, well, how about if we get a law passed in the Canadian government that I have to give them $100 so that it goes for good purposes like yours? Oh, yeah, that's fine. So there's sort of a disconnect in the personal life. He's a gentleman, a scholar, a nice guy. He lives according to libertarian precepts. But then he says, sure, we vote, and the Canadian government can order us around. It's all for the public good. So there's just this gigantic disconnect between the personal and the political.
There's a disconnect then. It does seem like there's a psychological component to this. In all the work you've done, psychology doesn't prop up too much. You've touched on it a little bit. In fact, you were even published in Psychology Today. But I'd like your views on psychology because it is the focus of my podcast and essays, the psychology of statism. And I want to ask you if you see the belief in political authority as the root cause of statism, essentially the broad belief that we ought to have a ruling class telling us what to do socially. And that belief itself is what thereby gives rise to the physical apparatus of statism.
Before I answer that, there's something I wanted to say that I forgot, and that's the rise of Javier Milei in Argentina.
Yes, yes.
When we were talking about how many libertarians are there. I mean, here's a guy who says Murray Rothbard is my hero. By the way, I'm one of the 8 people who he considers a mentor, so I'm just honored beyond belief at that. But he's an anarcho-capitalist. He's not a minarchist or a classical liberal. He's an anarcho-capitalist. He's the president of Argentina. So, when we talk about how few libertarians there are, I mean, he got elected. And in the recent election, his party even increased. So I thought I would just mention that because I forgot to mention that before. But as to the psychology, I think, look, I used to play the violin. I'm what's called a hit violinist. You hire me to play near your enemy, and I squeak and I squawk and I drive them crazy. But I'm a mediocre violinist. And there's a conductor, and the conductor has a little thingy, and he points to me whenever I make a mistake, and it stops the whole orchestra. There's nothing wrong with direction like that. When we've agreed, I mean, when I joined the orchestra, I agreed implicitly, there was no contract, that whatever the conductor said, I would try to do. And there's nothing wrong with taking orders. There's this friend of mine, Roderick Long, who is against bossism. We're not against bossism. We favor voluntary bossism. We just oppose coercive bossism. And sometimes, I guess, psychologically, people don't draw a sharp, gigantic chasm between voluntary bossism and coercive bossism. There's nothing. Look, you're my boss here. We were talking before the show, and I was saying, whatever you want to do, I'll do. You're my boss. You're interviewing me. I don't mind being bossed by you because I've agreed to be bossed by you. But if you came at me with a gun and said, do what I say or I'll shoot you, I'm not much going to like that. Of course, you would never do any such thing. So I think that in the idea of most people, they don't make that sharp distinction. They say, well, look, the government passed this law, the minimum wage law. And the minimum wage law is it's sort of in my mind because Ma'am Danny just won in New York City. And he wants to have a $30 an hour minimum wage in 2030. And I wonder, well, why not now if it's such a great idea? But the point is that he's now the mayor of the city, and we have a governor of the state, and we have Donald Trump, who's the president. And most people sort of say, well, they're in charge, they're the boss, or whatever the court says, the U.S. government court. Whereas we libertarians would look at it differently because we haven't agreed to be bound by what the government says. What's the contract that anyone ever signed with the government such that they can boss us around? That would be the anarchist slant on this. So I think from a psychological point of view, people don't make that sharp distinction the way anarcho-capitalist libertarians do. On the other hand, minarchists and classical liberal libertarians don't make that distinction either. That's why they're not ANCAPs. They're not anarcho-capitalists, but they're libertarians. And according to libertarianism, more widely defined, government is legitimate. Have to have armies to keep foreign bad guys off of us, police to keep local bad guys off of us, courts to determine who the good guy and the bad guy are. And they give their imprimatur to that. So it's only the anarcho-capitalist that goes the whole hog, dances the whole dance, namely deduces from the non-aggression principle and private property rights all the way down to ANCAP. Whereas these others, they give credence to the non-aggression principle and private property rights, but they don't deduce all the way down to the roots of what that really means.
Yes, that's exactly right. In my podcast, I devoted a 23 episode series to thinking about the psychology of statism. And in fact, I ran this past Michael Huemer, and I ran this past Stephan Kinsella. And the essence of the beginning of this is that psychology plays such an important role in the sense that since people believe that, and when I say people, I mean everyone except us few ANCAPs, since they have the belief itself that there ought to be coercive rulers that we defer our moral sensibilities to, that in itself is why there's a state. In other words, there's a direct causal relationship between this belief in the legitimacy of a ruling class, a coercive ruling class, and the state itself, meaning you actually can't have the state unless you have a ubiquitous population-wide belief in political authority. Now, I want to stop right there and make sure that there's anything you might want to comment on that or disagree with.
No, I agree entirely with you. I mean, look, we libertarians are, ANCAPs are 0.5% of 1%. Suppose 50% of us were ANCAPs. There couldn't be a state. We would just, go like this to the state and ignore it. And there'd be nothing they could do about it because 3/4 of the police would be ANCAPs too. And so belief is a key. I just wanted to say that one of the logical implications of statism, let me start again. You and I might get into a fight. We get into a fight, and we need a government to make sure we behave. Well, if that's true, then we must also believe in world government. Because right now, you and I are in a state of anarchy between each other. We don't have any ruler over us except the government, which thinks it's the ruler, but you and I wouldn't acknowledge it. But right now, the relationship between Canada and Chile, between Belgium and Burundi, between China and, Canada, is one of anarchy. Namely, there is no world government. So if you believe that we need a domestic government because you and I might get into a fight and they have to make sure we behave with regard to each other, well, then you need a world government to make sure that Brazil and Burundi don't get into it. But most people oppose a world government. I think I forget which of the novels, 1984, the Brave New World, where they were Oceania, 3 countries. I forget which one was it?
It was 1984.
1984, you had 3 countries. Well, our ideal, paradoxically, we anarchists, is to have 8 billion governments, one for each. We should each be sovereign. And if you want to ask a girl out for a date, you can't ask a girl out for a date. You have to get your foreign minister to ask our foreign minister if you can have a date with her. I'm kidding about that. But paradoxically, we anarchists favor more governments. So if Quebec wants to secede from Canada, or the Basques wanted to secede from Spain, or any secession, we favor secession because that's more governments. So paradoxically, we favor secession on grounds of free association. Nobody should be compelled to be in a political association with people that they don't want to be. But we also favor it in that it moves us toward more 8 billion governments and away from 3 governments or God forbid 1 government. I mean, I'm Jewish. We're always running away from some government. The Germans accept us and then they don't like us, and then we go to England and now they don't much like us, and we keep running away. Well, if there was world government, where would we run to? Mars isn't open for customers yet, nor is the moon. So world government is an abomination, and most people would believe that world government is a bad thing. And yet, that's the logical implication of local statism.
And that's something that I'm glad I remembered to talk about. Just before you said that if 50% of us were ANCAP, you couldn't have a state. Now, that number itself, it's really the point that I want to focus on. What you're saying, and I think I'll say this correctly, is that the belief that's in the minds of men, in particular as it pertains to a state or a government or a ruling class of any kind. I don't care if it's the pharaohs of Egypt or the royalty of the Middle Ages or whatever it is, modern democracies. That belief establishes a social environment that is conducive to the power seeker types. In other words, it advertises or puts out there by their actions, by their human action beliefs, in the need for authority, they express that. They'll say, there ought to be a law, or they'll write their congressman, or they'll vote, or they'll teach their kids to sing the anthem. These actions collectively, if you have a ubiquitous belief in political authority, is an environment that is very attractive to the power seeker types, whether they be busybody types or all up the scale up to psychopaths. And that's why you have an institution that attracts those very types, and you thereby have the apparatus of the state. What that means is that if there's an erosion of that belief, not that we are at that point now, but if we were to theoretically have that, the environment itself changes because now it's not so conducive to these power seekers. It isn't as welcoming or hospitable. And they thereby do the very praxeological activity of weighing all their choices in life and now noticing that being a bartender is probably a little better than being a police officer. That I'm simply putting in very simple terms, praxeological choices among all the choices they have, whereby today, where the myth of authority is very ubiquitous, the attraction of a job in politics is ranking very high among all those other choices. They're not going to be that bartender or accountant. So insofar as the belief in authority may erode, the environment seems to me would necessarily erode in kind, so that over a period of time, you would have a natural withering of the state simply because that environment is less attractive. That's sort of part one of that series I mentioned, and I summarized it for you. I'd like your thoughts on that.
Well, I wanted to say that a lot of people think that the reason people think badly is because the public schools, high school, K through 12, high school, college, they're just taught statism. I think we have to go a little deeper and we have to say, well, why are they taught that? Why do all those people believe this stuff? And that's why I get back to biology and mutants. And I think that I'm a pessimist in terms of, really getting rid of statism. Yes, we have Javier Milei, and yes, we have Ron Paul, and yes, we have some other very, very good people, Murray Rothbard, Mises. By the way, Stephan Kinsella and Mike Huemer are buddies of mine, so we're all on very similar pages. But I think it goes deeper than the fact that kids are taught that. I think even when they're little, at preschool, I have grandchildren. When they were at preschool, they were grab. I think the biology, we have more of a veneer of civilization. A 2-year-old has no veneer of civilization. They just want to grab. The other point I wanted to make is, what is the propriety with us getting into politics? Should we not have a libertarian party? Because Libertarian Party is part of the state apparatus. It acquiesces in statism. It's trying to win political office. And Murray Rothbard, on a pragmatic ground, used to say, look, every 4 years or every 2 years, the average guy who is interested in bowling and, beer, every 4 years he perks up and he's interested in politics. So if we're going to convert people, we might as well, offer them an option. And I think to a great degree, when I first started, the word libertarianism never appeared. It got confused with librarianism or libertinism or something like that. Nowadays, even the bloody New York Times will mention libertarianism and they'll get it right. Which is amazing, because when I started this, they didn't understand what it was. They thought that libertarians were internally inconsistent because, as I said, on economic grounds, we're for liberty, and therefore we can't be for liberty in the other realm, and vice versa. Whereas we think that they're the ones who are inconsistent. So getting back to my own political interests, I ran for Assembly of New York State in, I guess it was 72, I forget when it was, somewhere back there. And my motto was block for disassembly. I was running for the Assembly, so I wanted to disassemble the Assembly. And I also came in third one year for the Libertarian candidate for vice president. That's my political interest. But more recently, I think that Donald is way more libertarian than Kamala. So I wrote a piece, open letter to libertarians. I said, look, if you're a libertarian and you live in California or Massachusetts, vote for the Libertarian Party, because Donald is going to lose big and he doesn't need your vote. On the other hand, if you live in Texas or Florida, Donald's going to win big, and again, he doesn't need your vote, so vote for the Libertarian. However, if you live in a purple state, Pennsylvania, some of these other places where it's going to be close, vote for Donald. Don't vote for the Libertarian Party because Donald needs every inch. I didn't know he would win that well, but I thought he needed every Libertarian vote. So I think that Donald, beforehand and now, would have been a much better a libertarian, closer to libertarianism than Kamala. I thought Kamala would be like Obama or Biden, which is just horrible. Whereas, look, he's not that great on tariffs. He's a little weak on this or that, a little weak on legalizing drugs. But what the heck? Compared, it's sort of like if we were slaves and the master said you could vote between overseer goody and overseer baddie, and overseer goody would beat the crap out of you once a month, and overseer baddie would beat the crap out of you every day, we vote for overseer goody. Doesn't mean that we like overseer goody. He beats the crap out of us once a month. It doesn't mean we support slavery. It just means a little self-preservation. I mean, libertarianism is not a suicide pact. And I think we were entitled to pick the Republican this time. Not always. Sometimes the Republicans are wrong. Which state legalized cocaine? It was Oregon. Oregon is not a red state. Oregon is a blue state. They reneged on it, but at least that was very libertarian to legalize cocaine and heroin. It's almost unheard of. And in Las Vegas, they legalized prostitution, which is civilized. I mean, you don't put consenting adults in jail for doing their thing with each other if you're civilized, and the right wing is not civilized on this way. I mean, you look at Fox News and those newscasters, they want to put people in jail for heroin and prostitution and pornography, and that's just anathema to all libertarians.
I'm fascinated by this causal link that I mentioned, and I want to add to that just so you kind of have a rounded view of how I look at it, at the psychology of it. I think of three causally related factors. One is this ubiquitous belief in the legitimacy of a political coercive ruling class. The second is the state itself, and the third is propaganda, which we all know what that is. And I see a clear causal link between these three things in almost a circular type of approach. So you have this belief, it's necessary for you to have a state at all. Like you said before, if you didn't have the belief enough, you really couldn't have a state. The state needs that myth of authority, but like any false belief, like Santa Claus, it really doesn't stand up to the light of day very well. So it has to do something to make sure that belief is reinforced, and that's propaganda. So that's your kind of third piece of that. And of course, when propaganda is successful, which it almost always is, it goes ahead and does reinforce that myth of authority, and you have that sort of toxic causal codependency going on. What fascinates me, and I consider myself highly optimistic in contrast a bit to your relative pessimism, I see that propaganda as having been seriously affected by the internet's capabilities of decentralizing information and all but, or at least in the process of drowning out a whole lot of that propaganda now, because now people are not forced within these narrow constraints of what they're permitted to listen to. And to me, this is a very new thing in history. In fact, it's only really seems to have exploded in the last maybe 5 or 7 years when we see the CNNs and the Foxes and these major media outlets really losing viewership, and they're to me it seems like they're on the verge of bankruptcy. I can't even overemphasize how significant this is, because if the government can't successfully propagandize, and this is indeed a fundamentally causal loop of propaganda to this myth, propaganda can't hold up the myth. What does that mean? And it seems to me that's a very encouraging prospect.
Well, I was born in 41, and we got a TV in 47, and there were 3 stations. There was CBS, NBC, and ABC, and then there was PBS, and that was it. And they all had pretty much the New York Times view. Sort of moderate left, not total Ma'am Danny, Bernie Sanders left, but moderate left, and that was it. Now, how many TV stations are there? 500? I'm not sure.
More than that, I think.
Some ungodly number. And when you talk about blogs and Substacks and this and that and the other, it's just amazing how many ways we can communicate with each other. We have Wikipedia, which is a little leftish oriented, but now we just got Grokpedia. Elon Musk just started with Grokpedia, which is not left wing. It's sort of a counter to that. So we get information from all sorts of places, and it's just amazing. There was this woman, I forget her name. She was a New York Times reporter, and she was hounded out of the New York Times because she favored Israel. And then she started her own blog, and now she's the head of CBS. And this is just amazing. I mean, this sort of stuff never would have happened. I mean, her thing was a blog, and the blog started with her and her mother. I don't know the specifics of that, but it started small, and she has great talent, and she just built it up and built it up, and I think she sold it to CBS for zillions of dollars, and this is just an emblem or an indication of exactly what you're saying. Nowadays, we have zillions of sources of information, whereas in the good old days of CBS, NBC, and ABC, and that was it, it was very narrow, and everyone got one sort of a view. On the other hand, and there is another hand, I'm a professor. Do we pass the Sodom and Gomorrah test? What's the Sodom and Gomorrah test? God was going to smite Sodom and Gomorrah. The angel said, please, if I can find 10 righteous people, save them. He couldn't. What's the Sodom and Gomorrah test in academia? Are there 10 professors at Harvard out of 3,200 professors who are either conservative or libertarian? The answer is no. At my school, Loyola University, New Orleans, we have maybe 300 professors. How many are either conservative or libertarian? 3 or 4, maybe 5, depending. Next door, Tulane, again, 3 or 4, and they have, I think, 1,700 professors. So the academia is almost a monopoly of the left, almost quite. Thank God Donald is trying to kick the butt of Columbia, my alma mater, and Harvard, and saying, if I can put words in Donald's mouth, it's sure, you want to be have no intellectual diversity, and you want to be anti-Semite, fine, go do it. Just do it with your own money. Don't do it with the public dime. And don't think about tax exempt status, because that's for people who are doing stuff in the public good, and you're just promoting socialism and anti-Semitism, and that's not exactly public good in his view. So again, I'm a big fan of Donald in many things, which is a little strange for an anarcho-capitalist, but overseer goody, overseer baddie. He is overseer goody.
I love how the idea of propaganda is something akin to oxygen to a biological life form. It seems like they need it. The state needs propaganda, as I said, to reinforce that belief in authority. And I got to thinking of propaganda from the state's point of view. Like, again, just a thought experiment. Why do we never, I'm not asking this question, it's sort of more of a, food for thought question. Why do we never see the state take a break from propaganda? They never take Sunday off, so to speak. They never lift their foot off the gas pedal of propaganda. And then as I thought about it more, I realized, gee, that's not just true in the United States. And when I say propaganda, I just mean just coming off as being the savior of all of us. That's utterly necessary, crazy, and, world falls apart without them, that kind of thing. I realized that across time and geography, this is true. You never see any state, anywhere, anytime letting up on propaganda. I don't mean saying we're illegitimate. I just mean taking a rest. And then I thought about human action and praxeology. And part of what that teaches us is humans will put out the least effort to get the most benefit they can. They want to expend the least resource to get the most they can. And that fits a little because you see the state, even though the state is not a human being making human action, it's a collection of them. And you never see the state lowering their level of propaganda. That would strongly suggest to me that the level of propaganda they engage in is exactly what they need, or more, perhaps, in other words, the minimum what they need or what they perceive to need to keep that myth going. And that should explain, or it seems to explain, why they never let up. And then the last thing I want to say before you comment is, if that's true, and if indeed it would be catastrophic for the state to reduce the intensity of propaganda in the same way that we were to reduce our oxygen input, isn't it a problem for them that the internet has decentralized information flow now and is starting to erode propaganda's efficacy itself?
Yeah, well, there's more competition. I mean, I have a blog. You pretty much everyone has a blog nowadays or a Substack.
I do.
There you go. I've got one too. So we have many, many alternatives competing with government propaganda. You know, an obvious disagreement, a pushback to what you just said is right now the government is not working. For the last month or so, it is, I think, now that we've had the shutdown of government. Well, not really. The government is still working. The government is still omnipresent, even though it's supposedly shut down. You know, a scenario to me that comes to mind when you talk about this stuff is the following. We start in 1776, and we have a government, and some government bureau goes out to Western Pennsylvania or Ohio, where the 13 colonies that it wasn't really part of the government yet. And he tells some Ohioan, Eastern Ohio or Western Pennsylvania, and he says, "Hey, we have this new thing. It's called the government." And the guy says, "Oh, that's great. Congratulations. We'll trade. We'll be good neighbors." He says, "You don't understand. You're part of it." And he says, well, "Me, I'm not a good joiner. I don't join anything. What is it? Groucho Marx said I would never join any group that would have me." Well, this guy in Ohio was a Groucho Marx, and he doesn't want to join. And the government official says, "Tough. You joined. You're part of us." Well, what's that? That's kidnapping. That's capture. I mean, you know, we have implicit contracts. You go to a restaurant and you order a cup of coffee, and they give you the cup of coffee, and you pay $5 for it. Fine. There was no contract, but there was an implicit contract that, you know, if you order the coffee, they'll pay for it. And there was also an implicit contract that they're not going to poison the coffee, and that's fine. But there's no implicit contract that we agreed to be part of the government. I mean, that's a big step. You know, you buy a house, you got to sign 50,000 different pages. You buy a car, you have to sign 500 pages worth of agreement. You join a country, there should be a contract there, but where was the contract? Now, there was a contract for immigrants, legal immigrants. They signed a contract, but the question comes up, well, what right did the government have to impose it on them in the first place? Because they didn't start with a contractual basis. They just started. They grew like Topsy. So this is another way of looking at the obligation. And here, Mike Huemer is very good on this when he writes about authority. He has an excellent book on when do you owe authority to anybody. And my view, and I'm sure his view, would be that we owe authority if we've agreed to give authority. Otherwise, we don't owe it. We don't owe it to these people in Washington, D.C. You know, it's interesting. We're in 9 out of the 10 richest counties. Which city are they all around? Washington, D.C., obviously, because the money from the whole country goes there, and then a little bit of it goes back, and then a lot of it stays there. Well, this is a racket. These people are charlatans if they think that we owe an obligation to them for this.
Yeah. Doesn't that really tie back to that myth? I mean, that belief is what seems to cloud the mind. And I think that's why you have this disconnect that you mentioned at the earlier part of our discussion in people's minds. They have this indoctrinated belief that the state is legitimate, and yet they have their own moral intuitions in their private life, which are quite anarchistic, as we say. And I think they'll really interact very much, those two pieces of themselves. When they talk politics, they are themselves talking politics. When they are simply interacting peacefully and consensually with their neighbors, that's them doing that too, not realizing that they are abiding by 100%, anarchism, the non-aggression principle. But we see this because we're the ones trying to message. When we try to talk to our friends, relatives, whoever it may be, and start to introduce these ideas, I think what we are doing is creating this disconnect in their mind. We're exposing their mind to the conflict between the two. And I think that's one reason we see emotional reactions so often, because we'll call it the good part of their mind, their true self, their anarchist part, is now in conflict because it's exposed it. It's an idea trying to pierce into that fog that thinks the state is legitimate, and it doesn't like that. And I think that might be why we get negative reactions at first. Is that your experience?
Oh yeah. You know, I've been teaching college level since, I don't know, 1971 or somewhere in there, and I must have thousands of students. And the anarchy doesn't come up that much, a little bit more the free enterprise, because I'm teaching economics. So, Invisible Hand, Adam Smith, and Henry Hazlitt, Mises, Rothbard kind of stuff. And I'm very happy to say that about a few more than a dozen of my former students are now economics professors. We don't agree 100%, but they are now teaching whole new generations of other students, some vestige of free enterprise and limited government. And there are, every once in a while, I'll get an email from somebody who was a student of mine 30 years ago saying, what I got from you was great and it changed my life. So even if they're not economics professors, the average professor, such as myself, who was teaching, 100 students every year, 100 different students every year, give or take, is spreading the word. And, the two books that converted me were Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand and Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. So I use those books often in my classes as required reading. And again, some students are just closed to this. They hate it and they think I'm a fascist. Other students are indifferent or bored by it. I can't say how you can be bored by this stuff, but they are. And then you get a third group that really like this stuff. And it's a pleasure and honor to be a professor and to promote liberty and promote good, solid economics.
Yeah, I love hearing stories like that because for no other reason, you've helped someone. And when I say that, I think of myself and I sometimes ask myself the question, would I have liked my life better if I had never been exposed to these ideas and I just lived my life in sort of that ignorant bliss that most people live their lives in politically, where they never really examine it? And it was an absolute no. I would never want that to be the case. I'm glad I was red pilled, as they say, even though that does create some hardships in the other sense. Sometimes it's hard to make or keep friends. Sometimes it creates conflicts, but I would not change a thing. And the people I've spoken to on that in that regard agree. I'm glad I woke up. I would not want it the other way. So I say that because for me, messaging has really evolved less as a effort to try to increase those numbers so that we reach some tipping point, and more to simply, hopefully, just help an individual person so that if they can wake up, I believe their life will be just a smidge better. And so it's almost a personal thing now.
Yeah, I was thinking, is it because they're stupid? And my answer is no. Einstein was a socialist. Now, I'm not in any position to verify that Einstein was a bright guy. I accept it because I don't know physics, I don't know math. But let's stipulate for argument's sake that he was a bright guy. He was a socialist. So it can't, and there are a lot of bright people, like this guy Mamdani. He's not a dummy. I'm sure if he had an IQ test, he would do very well. It's not intelligence or lack of intelligence that leads people away from liberty, because there are very, very bright people who concoct all sorts of wonderful things in favor of the state. I mean, in economics, there's this thing called market failure. What's market failure? Monopoly, externalities, public goods, inequality. They keep inventing more and more market failures. They're bright people. Some of them win Nobel Prize in economics. They're not dummies. They're very, very smart people, and yet it goes right over their head. And it's very strange because, I mean, like Einstein, you can't get a smarter person than Einstein, let's stipulate. And yet he didn't get it. And he lived after Adam Smith. It's not that nobody ever wrote about this before him. I mean, Mises, I think, was contemporary or close by, and there was Menger and von Bawerk. There were a lot of people. There was the School of Salamanca, for goodness sakes, which was the predecessor to the Austrian school, and it was Jesuits and Dominicans. So it's not as if the case for free enterprise was not out there that Einstein couldn't read if he wanted to read. But he was a Marxist. Even Marx was not a dummy. I mean, you can't be a dummy and write a book of 500 pages. So I don't think that the reason people don't get it is because they're stupid, because there are very, very smart people that don't get it. And we have to look at other sources of why they don't get it, why it's like, what did that Sisyphus pushing the rock up the hill, and the rock keeps coming back down. That's what we're doing. We're pushing the rock up, it keeps coming down, because we're contending, I think, with biology. I think we're contending with something that's really deeply embedded and impervious to logic and reason, because we have logic and reason all on our side. I mean, the case for anarchism, the case for limited government libertarianism is so undeniable. So it's not because we don't have the argument, it's because it just goes right over their heads no matter how bright they are.
Here's part of why I see it, though, as more rooted in psychology and not biology, if I could push back just a little bit.
Sure.
So let me give you one argument. I feel if it was rooted in biology, we almost couldn't get red pilled ourselves because our biological constraints would prevent that. And yet we are direct living proof that it's not biological, or at least it's not fully biological, because after all, we managed to do it. Now, I can see where the argument can be made that there's a biological predilection for it. In other words, we might lean that way, and that might be why the majority tend to be that way, less critical in their thinking. That, I think, is a plausible avenue. But the other reason I think psychology is so important is because it does seem to be that is exactly what is happening here. We are indoctrinated from childhood in the public schools and by our own parents and by our, other mentors and so on, to simply believe the state is legitimate, just in the same way as we often raise kids believing in Santa Claus. And yet they get past that because the Santa Claus myth can't stand up to the light of day. And that's where psychology comes in. We notice and observe that in ourselves, anyone else who gets red pilled, with enough of that clear thinking, we get past that. In other words, we get past that psychological barrier. And after that, we seem impervious to it. Propaganda has no efficacy on us whatsoever.
Well, it's interesting as to what you can deduce from what. They say that you can deduce, what is it? Chemistry underlies biology and physics underlies chemistry. And they say that if you're a shoemaker and you meet someone, you look at his shoes. If you're a clothing guy, you look at his clothing. And if you're an economist, you ask him how much money he makes a year, stuff like that. So, we all have different eyeglasses and we look at things from different eyeglasses. I don't disagree that psychology plays a crucially important part. I'm sure you don't denigrate biology totally. I would just say in response to your pushback, well, we're just mutants. We're nuts biologically. Somehow, not that we started that way. By the way, I started as a total pinko. I was Jewish, Brooklyn. Bernie Sanders was a buddy of mine. We were on the track team together. My views and his views were just about the same. So I'm not saying that I'm a mutant, that I started that way, but I'm a mutant, and I think you're a mutant, and I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean that as a compliment. The mutation is that we're open to it. And when Ayn Rand came to Brooklyn College to speak, and I came to listen to her and criticize her, and she and Nathaniel Branden converted me with Atlas Shrugged. And Atlas Shrugged has probably converted more people to libertarianism than, I don't know. My generation, I think we owed Ayn Rand. The generation after me, I think Ron Paul was the greatest popularizer. I'm not sure who it is now, but. So I agree that psychology is crucially important. I just think that underlying psychology is biology, and maybe underlying biology is chemistry and physics. I don't know. These are just speculations on my part. But there are so many people who are so bright, and you try to reason with them, and they just don't get it. And maybe they're psychologically predisposed against it, and maybe it's biologically, or maybe it's a little of each. I'm not sure. We're just speculating about these things.
One of the things that really white pills me is that I no longer see it as a necessity that we can only get there by making more ANCAPs. I don't think that's the case whatsoever anymore. And I used to absolutely think that. In other words, you had to reach a tipping point of pure ANCAPs. I've thrown that in the trash. What we need is a tipping point of generalized skepticism of statism. It doesn't have to be the pure 100% ANCAP that we would like to see. And by the way, when we do get someone fully ANCAP, and loving that, it's a bonus. So I made the analogy of a bucket of skepticism that we hope reaches a tipping point after which the state simply cannot function. And I used to think the only thing that adds to that bucket is our personal cup of ANCAP skepticism once we get red pilled. And that's the only thing that adds to that bucket. And today I see it as a bucket that gets filled every time anyone, anywhere gets slightly more skeptical and, wondering of, that's BS that what they just did. The state, I don't like what they're doing. And they get a little bit more, that thimbleful of skepticism gets added. Only now you don't need that X million of ANCAPs, you need 8 billion people to get just a little more skeptical. And that bucket, I think, is in the process of filling up. Again, thanks to the fact that the internet is drowning out propaganda more than ever before, and thereby adding to skepticism. That white pills me incredibly.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, many of our heroes were not ANCAPs. Ayn Rand was not an ANCAP. Robert Nozick, not an ANCAP. Milton Friedman, not an ANCAP. Ron Paul, not an ANCAP. Although I'm not sure about Ron Paul. I once asked him and he didn't really answer directly. There are many, many people who are magnificent libertarians who are not ANCAP. And we take our hats off to them. ANCAP is better, but that's great. And even people who are not libertarians, if they just have a little suspicion, like I have a freshman class, and I'm trying to tell them about the minimum wage, that the minimum wage is not a floor on the wages that boosts wages. Rather, it's a barrier over which you have to jump to get a job in the first place. And the higher it is, the harder it is to get a job. And they're appalled. I mean, they've never heard of this. This is just like from Mars or something. And they think it's evil because their every instinct is to help the poor. And they've been taught the way to help the poor is to pay them more, and the minimum wage will make sure that nobody falls below the level of the minimum wage. It's a struggle I mean, the minimum wage is no real big deal, although with me, it's sort of a litmus test. And I could see what's going on with these young kids. They're 18, 19, they're freshmen, and everything that they believe in, I'm attacking. And they don't much like it. People don't like being pushed around intellectually, and I'm pushing them. I on any exam, I tell them, look, you don't have to agree with me. I'll ask, well, what's Block's view on the minimum wage, and explain that. So you don't have to be untrue to yourself. You don't have to say something on exam that you really don't believe in order to butter me up. That would be appalling. But I could see the inner struggle over that, and the minimum wage and rent control and free trade are three of the things that economists mostly agree on, and they've never had that before. All through high school, and some of them are sophomores. They haven't had it in other disciplines, and I could see the struggle going on, and it's a beautiful thing because every once in a while you see a little light bulb flashing on top of their head, and it's a very wonderful thing.
It's so great that you see that in the youth, because they are growing up to be more influential, and if you're adding to that bucket of skepticism, gee, it can only be a good thing. And that kind of ties to the final thing or not final, one of the many things that white pills me. And that is when we talk about the erosion of propaganda, in particular, thanks to the internet, then we think about the boomers, or the oldest of the amongst us. I mean, I'm a boomer, and but most of my generation is probably the most indoctrinated and propagandized of all the age groups. Why? Because we're the ones who grew up with the CBS Evening News, and we had those TV grids that we looked at the stations and we looked at the time, and we knew exactly what we could choose from at the appropriate time. We were used to being fed information, and that's the older ones. But the younger you are, the less. It doesn't mean that you're more likely to be ANCAP, but it does mean that you are used to a variety of choices that doesn't necessarily include what the state would like you to hear.
You're quite right. There's many, many options nowadays that there weren't before. I promised an hour for you, and the hour is just about going. So let me thank you for an exhilarating hour. I really enjoyed. My only criticism of you is you live in Florida. You should live in New Orleans so we could have lunch every day.
Well, I promise you that I will. If I'm passing through New Orleans, you will hear about it. And if you're passing through Southwest Florida, I want you to give me a call. I want to thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Everyone, I'm going to have links to some of Walter's work in our show notes. Please be sure to check out his works. It's a wonderful body of work that you'll want to read up on or watch. And I'll include some YouTube videos that he's been featured on. And I think that'll wrap it up. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today on the White Pill Box. Take care and see you next time.
Thanks so much to all subscribers and everyone who joined today. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.